The afternoon sun hung lazily over Draenor village, casting long shadows across the weathered cobblestones of the marketplace. Merchants called out their wares with practiced enthusiasm. Adventurers bartered for supplies, and the familiar rhythm of daily life in Gielinor continued unchanged, as it had for centuries. The willow trees swayed gently in the breeze, their ancient branches rustling with secrets older than memory. Then, without fanfare or cosmic rupture, he appeared. Between one heartbeat and the next, a figure stood on the cobblestone path near the marketplace, not materializing in a flash of divine light or tearing through the fabric of reality, but simply existing where nothing had been moments before. He was blocky, impossibly angular, his limbs moving with a geometric precision that defied the organic fluidity of Gielinor's inhabitants. His cyan shirt and blue pants seemed almost cartoonishly simple against the medieval fantasy backdrop of thatched roofs and stone walls. Steve stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, his head rotating in sharp, measured increments as he surveyed his surroundings. His expression, if the flat planes of his face could be called an expression, revealed nothing. No confusion, no alarm, just calculated observation. A nearby farmer dropped his basket of cabbages. Steve's head tilted slightly, processing the architecture, the NPCs going about their routines, the distant outline of Lumbridge Castle at the horizon. His mouth didn't move, but text appeared in the air beside him, glowing faintly with an ethereal quality that belonged to no known magic system in Gielinor. A new world to explore. What resources does this place have? He took a single step forward, his foot landing with an oddly hollow sound against the cobblestone. Then another. His movements were deliberate, economical, lacking the subtle imperfections of organic life. He approached a nearby oak tree, one of the village's oldest, planted when Draenor was first established centuries ago, and simply stared at it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Steve's arm swung forward in a perfectly straight arc, his fist connecting with the tree trunk. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 5th strike, reality itself seemed to hiccup. The ancient oak didn't splinter or crack. It simply broke into perfect cubic fragments that hung suspended in the air for a heartbeat before condensing into neat wooden blocks that vanished into Steve's impossibly deep pockets. The tree was gone, completely, as if it had never existed. The farmer screamed. Guards stationed at the village gate turned sharply, hands instinctively reaching for their bronze swords. A nearby adventurer, fresh from defeating goblins in the nearby hills, froze mid-stride, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't magic, not as Gielinor understood it. There were no runes consumed, no prayer invoked, no enchantment spoken. The tree had simply ceased to exist because this geometric stranger had decided it should. Steve seemed unbothered by the growing attention. He arranged 4 wooden blocks in a square pattern on the ground in front of him, not placing them naturally, but materializing a perfect wooden grid that hovered at waist height. A crafting table. The construct solidified instantly, defying every principle of carpentry and enchantment simultaneously. His blocky hands moved across the table's surface, and more wood vanished from his inventory. Within seconds, he withdrew a crude pickaxe. Wooden planks formed into a tool head and handle with impossible geometry. No smith had forged it. No craftsman had assembled it. It simply existed because he'd decided it should. Text appeared beside him. Wood acquired. Stone next. He turned toward the marketplace fountain, its ancient stonework carved with protective runes blessed by Saradomin priests generations ago. He raised his new pickaxe. That's when the first guard found his voice. "Halt! In the name of King Rold and the kingdom of Misthalin, identify yourself." Steve paused, his pickaxe hovering inches from the consecrated stone. His head rotated a full 90 degrees to face the approaching guards, a movement that sent chills through everyone watching. More text materialized. NPC dialogue detected. Skipping. The fountain shattered under his pickaxe strike, sacred stone transmuting into perfectly uniform blocks that disappeared into his inventory. Holy water that had flowed for 3 centuries evaporated into nothing. The protective enchantments, woven by the finest mages in Varric, simply stopped working. This was the moment Draenor Village realized something fundamentally wrong had entered their world. This was the moment a humble villager, hands trembling, sent an urgent messenger pigeon toward the grand exchange. And this was the moment Steve began gathering resources, utterly indifferent to the chaos beginning to unfold around him, his mind already calculating what he would build next in this strange new world that followed such different rules than his own. The catastrophe had begun, not with thunder and divine wrath, but with the simple act of a blocky figure punching a tree, crafting a table, and mining stone with methodical efficiency. Captain Harwick of the Draenor Guard had seen his share of threats in 23 years of service. Bandits, dark wizards, the occasional demon summoned by overzealous necromancers. He knew how to assess danger, how to classify an enemy by their equipment, their stance, their aura of magical energy. Steve defied every metric. "Surround him," Harwick commanded, his voice cracking slightly as 6 guards fanned out in a practice formation. Bronze swords gleamed in the afternoon sun, shields raised in defensive postures. "You there, identify yourself immediately. State your business in Draenor Village or face arrest." Steve's head swiveled toward them with that same unsettling mechanical precision. His hands remained empty. No weapon, no staff, no visible rune pouch. The text appeared again, floating beside his blocky form. "Hostile NPCs detected. Building defensive structure." What happened next would be recounted in taverns for weeks, each telling more incredulous than the last. Steve's hand dipped into his pocket, impossibly deep, as if accessing some void space beyond comprehension, and withdrew a perfect cube of dirt. Not a handful of soil, but a geometrically precise block measuring exactly 1 meter in all dimensions. He placed it on the ground in front of him with a soft thunk. Then another, then another. Within 15 seconds, a crude wall stood between him and the advancing guards, constructed from blocks of earth that somehow remained perfectly stacked without mortar or structural support. "What in Saradomin's name?" Harwick breathed. "It's just dirt," one of the younger guards shouted. "Break through it." They charged. 3 guards swung their bronze swords at the earthen barrier with full force, expecting it to crumble under the assault. The blades bounced off with a metallic clang, as if striking solid stone. The dirt blocks didn't crack, didn't chip, didn't even show scratches. They simply existed, as immutable as the laws of physics themselves. Behind the wall, Steve continued building. More blocks appeared from his bottomless inventory, stone now, then wood, then something gray and blast-resistant that no one recognized. The structure grew upward and outward with impossible speed, each block snapping into place with perfect precision. Within a minute, he'd constructed a small shelter with walls, a roof, and what appeared to be a wooden door. "Mages!" Captain Harwick bellowed, backing away from the expanding structure. "We need magical support now." 2 village mages rushed forward, robes billowing. They were low-level practitioners, capable of basic elemental spells and protection prayers, nothing extraordinary. But magic was magic, and surely it would prove more effective than physical weapons. The first mage launched a water strike, blue energy crackling towards Steve's shelter. The spell dissipated harmlessly against the wooden planks, leaving no scorch mark, no damage, not even moisture. The second mage tried Fire Blast, her most powerful offensive spell. It fizzled out the same way, as if the structure existed in a different reality, where Gielinor's magic simply didn't apply. "Impossible," the first mage whispered, his confidence evaporating. "Protection spells shouldn't work like that. There's no prayer activated, no enchantment." Steve emerged from his shelter, carrying something that made everyone freeze. It was a pickaxe, but not like any pickaxe they'd ever seen. The head was a brilliant blue, shimmering with an internal light that suggested it was crafted from diamond. In Gielinor, diamond tools were theoretical concepts, mathematical curiosities discussed by master smiths in hushed tones. The material was too brittle, too difficult to work with. Yet here stood this blocky stranger, casually wielding what should have been impossible. Text appeared. Resource gathering complete. Exploring dungeon systems. He walked past the guards, not around them, but directly past, as if they were obstacles to navigate rather than threats to engage. When one guard attempted to grab his shoulder, Steve simply kept walking, the guard's hand sliding off as if gripping soap. Another tried to tackle him low. Steve didn't stumble or fall. He just continued forward at his steady, mechanical pace, the guard bouncing off like hitting a mobile wall. "Stop him!" Harwick screamed, but his voice carried more desperation than authority now. Steve reached the entrance to Draenor Manor's cellar, a dangerous area populated by zombies and dark forces, normally avoided by sensible folk. He descended the stone steps without hesitation, his diamond pickaxe gleaming in the torchlight. The scream started 30 seconds later. By the time backup arrived from Lumbridge, a full squad of higher-level guards and a priest of Ceradomin, the situation had evolved beyond recognition. Steve had emerged from the cellar after 18 minutes. Behind him, the zombie population that had terrorized the area for decades was simply gone, not vanquished through holy magic or combat prowess, but removed. When scouts ventured down to investigate, they found the entire underground structure had been systematically dismantled, stone walls deleted, spawning points erased. The zombies hadn't been killed. They'd been prevented from existing in the first place. "This is unprecedented," Father Eric intoned, his weathered face pale beneath his white robes. "Even the dragonkin, even the gods themselves work within certain parameters. They destroy, they create, but they respect the fundamental structure of Gielinor. This being, he's editing reality like a scribe correcting parchment." Steve stood in the village square now, surrounded by over 30 armed guards maintaining a cautious distance. He'd constructed what could only be described as a base of operations. a multi-story structure made from materials nobody could identify. Glass blocks that weren't quite glass. Stone bricks that weren't quite stone. Wooden planks cut with impossible precision. Most disturbing was the farm he'd planted. In the span of an hour, he'd cleared a 50-meter plot of land, tilled it with perfect geometric rows, and grown crops from seed to harvest maturity. Wheat that normally took weeks to grow had sprouted, matured, and been harvested in minutes. He'd then crafted bread at a wooden bench that appeared in his hands and disappeared just as quickly. "He doesn't need our economy," someone whispered in the crowd. "Doesn't need our services. He's completely self-sufficient." A high-level adventurer named Survivin, famous for his completion of desert treasure and possession of ancient magics, stepped forward. His armadillo armor gleamed, enchanted with some of the most powerful defensive runes in Gielinor. He'd faced demons, dragons, and undead horrors. Surely he could handle one strange newcomer. "Stranger," Survivin announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to respect. "You have violated multiple laws of the Kingdom of Mistalin. You will cease your activities and submit to questioning or face consequences." Steve's head turned toward him. Text appeared. "PvP enabled? Checking server settings." Survivin activated his protection from melee prayer, feeling the familiar divine warmth of Saradomin's blessing. "Last warning." Steve reached into his inventory and withdrew a sword. It was unlike anything Survivin had seen. The blade glowed with a purple enchantment that seemed to pulse with raw power, and the entire weapon appeared to be constructed from a crystalline material that shifted between solid and ethereal states. "Netherite," one of the watching mages breathed, though no one knew what the word meant. Survivin charged, his enchanted scimitar aimed for a disabling strike. He was fast, level 82 in combat, with reflexes honed by years of PvP combat in the wilderness. His blade moved in a perfect arc toward Steve's blocky torso. Steve's sword moved faster. The block was executed with mechanical perfection, not the flow and parry of a trained swordsman, but the simple absolute motion of someone following an algorithm. When the blades connected, Survivin's enchanted scimitar shattered. Not chipped or dulled, but completely destroyed, fragments dissolving into pixels of light. Before Survivin could process what happened, Steve's return strike connected with his armadillo chestplate. The armor, blessed by a god, enchanted by the finest mages, worth millions of gold pieces, cracked straight through. Survivin felt the impact in his bones, his health bar plummeting from full to critical in a single hit. He stumbled backward, gasping, his protection prayer still active but completely ineffective. The divine shield that should have reduced damage by 40% hadn't triggered. The armor that should have absorbed most of the impact had failed. Steve's attack existed outside the damage calculation system that governed all combat in Gielinor. "Fall back!" Captain Harwick screamed. "Everyone fall back!" The guards retreated in organized chaos, dragging the wounded Survivin with them. Steve didn't pursue. He simply returned to his crafting bench, processing the cobblestone he'd gathered into more refined blocks, his expression unchanging. Father Eric approached carefully, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Please," he said, his voice trembling, "help us understand. What are you? What do you want?" Text appeared beside Steve's head, glowing in the gathering dusk. "Exploring new biome, gathering resources, building base, Standard procedure. But why? Father Eric pressed. What purpose does this serve? Are you seeking power? Conquest? Divine ascension? Just playing. Those two words sent a chill through everyone present. Not conquest, not divine mission, not even malice. This entity with the power to reshape reality, to ignore their strongest warriors and mightiest spells, to casually dismantle centuries-old threats. He was just playing. Gielinor in all its history, its struggles, its carefully balanced factions and cosmic significance. It was all just a game to him. As the sun set over Draenor village, emergency messenger pigeons flew toward Varrock, Falador, and the Grand Exchange. The messages all carried the same desperate tone. Unknown entity has arrived. Classifications invalid. Combat ineffective. Magic ineffective. Prayer ineffective. Request immediate counsel of all major factions. This threat exceeds all established parameters. Recommend treating as potential apocalyptic event. And in the village square, Steve continued building, the rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of blocks being placed echoing through the night like a countdown to something no one could quite name. The Grand Exchange stood as a monument to commerce and power in the heart of Varrock, its vaulted ceilings and marble pillars speaking to centuries of accumulated wealth and influence. But the chamber deep beneath its trading floors, a room few knew existed, told a different story. Here the true architects of Gielinor's power structure gathered in times of existential crisis. The circular table was ancient, carved from a single piece of runestone that predated the God Wars. Around it sat figures who rarely occupied the same space. Grand Exchange, Guildmaster Lorn, his merchant robes concealing armor enchanted by the finest mages gold could buy. Sliska's former lieutenant Akthanakos, a Majorat whose loyalty to Zaros burned with the intensity of millennia. Commander Karasi of the Void Knights, her elite armor bearing scars from battles against creatures that would shatter lesser warriors' minds. And High Priest Driesel, representative of Saradomin's theological authority, his expression grave beneath his ceremonial hood. The tension in the room was palpable. "Let me understand this correctly," Guildmaster Lorn said, his fingers drumming against the runestone table. A single entity appears in Draenor village, a backwater settlement of no strategic importance. And within 6 hours he has dismantled a centuries-old zombie infestation, defeated one of our most accomplished adventurers in single combat, constructed structures using materials that don't exist in our catalogs, and demonstrated complete immunity to our entire magical framework. "That is correct," Commander Karasi replied, her voice clipped and professional, despite the absurdity of the words. "Our intelligence network has confirmed every detail. 3 independent witnesses watched him reduce an oak tree to blocks. Their word, not mine, through nothing more than repeated physical strikes. No axe, no tool, just his fist." Akthanakos leaned forward, his ancient eyes gleaming with an intensity that came from witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations. "I have lived for over 4,000 years. I have seen gods clash in the skies, watched the dragonkin reduce cities to ash, stood beside Zaros himself as he shaped empires from chaos. Never, and I emphasize never, have I encountered anything that operates like this. Steve." "Steve," High Priest Driesel repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "He doesn't even have a proper name. Just Steve. No title, no lineage, no divine mandate." And yet he wields power that makes a mockery of everything we understand about how reality functions. Lorne gestured to a stack of reports on the table, each one more disturbing than the last. Our economic analysts are already modeling the implications. If he can generate resources from nothing, process them instantly, and create finished goods without craftsmanship or time investment, the entire grand exchange becomes obsolete. Every guild, every trade route, every carefully balanced economic system we've built over centuries, irrelevant. It's worse than economics, Karasi interjected, spreading a tactical map across the table. Look at his combat profile. No attack style we can categorize. No defense rating we can measure. When Survivin engaged him, Steve's weapon bypassed every defensive calculation in our system. Prayer didn't reduce damage. Armor didn't absorb impact. It was as if he exists in a separate mechanical framework that overrides ours. Akthanakos' fingers traced patterns on the table, ancient Zarosian runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. I've been consulting the records from the Second Age. Zaros himself encountered entities from other planes of existence, beings that operated under different cosmic laws. But even they could be understood within a framework. They had weaknesses, limitations, points of leverage. This Steve. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He appears to have none. Everyone has weaknesses, Driesel countered, his faith in universal order refusing to bend. Perhaps we simply haven't identified them yet. Has anyone attempted to communicate with him beyond simple commands, to understand his motivations, his goals? Karasi shook her head. Father Eric tried. The entity responded with text, floating text that appears beside his head like some kind of primitive telepathy. His stated purpose is exploring and gathering resources. When asked why, he responded with just playing, as if all of Gielinor is some kind of game to him. The room fell silent. That single phrase, just playing, carried implications that none of them wanted to fully examine. High Priest Driesel stood, his robes rustling in the still air. This is what truly terrifies me, and what should terrify all of you. This being doesn't seek power in any form we recognize. He doesn't want to conquer territories, doesn't desire worship, shows no interest in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos that has defined our world since the First Age. And that's a problem? Lorne asked, genuinely confused. It's the fundamental problem, Driesel replied, his voice rising with passion. Our entire civilization, every kingdom, every faction, every philosophy, is built on the premise that power requires structure. Saradomin teaches that strength flows from divine hierarchy and righteous order. Zamorak preaches that power is seized through chaos and individual will. Even Guthix's balance philosophy acknowledges the interplay of cosmic forces. But Steve, he gestured helplessly at the reports. Steve operates outside all of it. He needs no gods, no prayers, no alliances, no economy, no teachers or masters. He is completely, terrifyingly self-sufficient. And if word spreads, if common adventurers and citizens learn that such autonomy is possible, what happens to the systems we've spent millennia constructing? Akthanakos' laugh was bitter and mirthless. You're worried about theological implications. How quaint. Let me tell you how it truly concerns a Zarosian. This entity threatens the fundamental concept of ascension through service. Zaros rewards loyalty with power, knowledge with advancement. The entire philosophy of my lord is that one must submit to higher wisdom to achieve greatness. But Steve achieved his power through no submission, no guidance, no divine patronage whatsoever. He crafted it himself, Karasi said quietly, understanding dawning in her eyes. That diamond pickaxe our scouts observed. He didn't buy it, didn't quest for it, didn't receive it as a divine gift. He gathered the materials and made it, through his own agency and effort. Impossible, Lorne protested. Diamond is too brittle for tools. Every master smith knows this. The material properties simply don't allow. In our framework, Akthanakos interrupted. But he's not operating in our framework, is he? He's imposed his own rules onto reality, and reality is bending to accommodate him. That's not magic as we understand it. That's something far more fundamental. He's rewriting the source code of existence itself. Drezel sank back into his chair, his face ashen. If common people learn this is possible, if they begin to question why they need gods, need kings, need any authority at all when one can simply reshape reality through individual will. Revolution, Karasi finished. Not political revolution that we could handle with military force. Philosophical revolution. The entire conceptual foundation of Gielinor's power structures collapsing. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Guildmaster Lorne broke it first, his merchant instincts cutting through the existential dread. We need to control the narrative, immediately. This information about Steve's capabilities cannot spread beyond those already aware. We classify him as... what? A demon? A new type of dragonkin? A demon can be banished, Akthanakos said. A dragonkin can be reasoned with or avoided. Steve is neither. He's something entirely novel, and any classification we apply will eventually be revealed as false. No, we need a different approach. Co-option, Karasi suggested. We've dealt with powerful entities before by bringing them into the system. Offer him something he wants. Status, territory, resources. He can create his own resources, Lorne reminded her. What could we possibly offer? Drezel's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. A challenge, not combat. He's already proven superior in that regard. But an intellectual challenge, a mystery. The entity said he was exploring, yes? What if we direct that exploration towards something that keeps him occupied? Something that doesn't threaten our existing order? Such as, Akthanakos asked, skeptical but intrigued. The God Wars dungeon, Drezel proposed. The ancient strongholds in the wilderness. The deeper regions of Demonheim. Places of genuine danger and mystery, far from population centers. We present it as new content for him to explore. New biomes, to use his terminology. If we can keep him engaged in discovery rather than construction in civilized areas. You want to use his curiosity against him, Karasi said, nodding slowly. Keep him busy in the dangerous peripheries, while we fortify our understanding of how he operates. Lorne was already making notes. We could send our best adventurers as guides, not to fight him, but to observe him more closely, learn his patterns, his limitations, assuming he has any. There's another option, Akthanakos said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. We could attempt to eliminate him. With what? Karasi demanded. Our strongest warrior couldn't scratch him. Our best mage's spells fizzled like candles in a storm. What force in Gielinor could possibly... Not forces from Gielinor, Akthanakos interrupted. Forces from beyond it. the entities that even the gods fear. What if we invited the Dragonkin to investigate this anomaly? Or better yet, what if we arranged for Steve to encounter the Queen Black Dragon? She exists partially outside our reality, in the void between worlds. Perhaps she operates under similar enough principles to actually harm him. You're suggesting we weaponize apocalyptic threats against an unknown entity, Drezel said, his horror evident. That's madness. What if it only makes him stronger? What if he defeats the Queen Black Dragon as easily as he dismantled those zombies, and then we've given him access to even more dangerous knowledge? Then we'd know definitively that nothing in Gielinor can stop him, Akthanakos replied coldly, and we'd need to consider alternative strategies. Such as, Lorne asked. The Majorat's smile was predatory. Apotheosis. If we cannot defeat him, we study him. Learn how his reality manipulation works. Harness it for ourselves. Zaros has returned to Gielinor in spirit form, gathering power. If we could combine his divine essence with Steve's reality editing capabilities. You want to create a god killer, Karasi breathed, or become one yourself? I want to ensure our survival, Akthanakos corrected, which requires adapting to this new paradigm. Steve has shown us that the rules we thought were absolute are merely suggestions. Suggestions that can be overridden by sufficient creative will. That knowledge alone is worth any risk. For 3 hours they debated, argued, and planned. Gradually, a multi-tiered strategy emerged, not because they agreed on philosophy, but because they shared a common fear. Commander Karasi would dispatch her most skilled Void Knights to shadow Steve's movements, maintaining a non-hostile distance. They would document everything: his construction patterns, resource gathering rates, combat techniques, and any sign of limitation or vulnerability. Father Eric would attempt continued dialogue, framing questions as friendly curiosity rather than interrogation. High Priest Drezel would craft a series of invitations, mysterious maps, cryptic clues, and hints about legendary locations filled with powerful resources and ancient mysteries. The goal was to guide Steve toward the God Wars dungeon, Daemonheim, and other high-level areas where his destructive potential would be isolated from major population centers. If he wanted to explore, they'd give him exploration targets that served their interests. If redirection failed and Steve approached critical infrastructure, Varrock Palace, the Grand Exchange, or holy sites, they would attempt controlled engagement. Not full combat, but measured tests designed to probe for weaknesses. Guildmaster Lorne had already commissioned the finest mages to study defensive ward variations that might interact differently with Steve's abilities. If all else failed, Akthanakos would accidentally let information about Steve's location reach the Dragonkin. The ancient Dragonkin, driven mad by the Stone of Jaws and sworn to destroy those who misuse its power, might perceive Steve as a reality-warping threat worthy of their terrible attention. It was a gamble that could backfire catastrophically, but desperation bred dangerous strategies. No one said it aloud, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. If Steve proved truly unstoppable and hostile, they would need to evacuate key populations and let him have Gielinor, retreat to Prifdinas, the elven city protected by crystal magic older than the gods, or even attempt to contact Guthix's world guardian and pray that entity's unique status provided some defense against Steve's reality manipulation. As the council prepared to adjourn, Guildmaster Lorne spoke the question they'd all been avoiding. What if he's not alone? What if he's a scout and there are others like him waiting to arrive? The silence was answer enough. Akthanakos stood, his ancient frame radiating an authority that came from surviving 4,000 years of cosmic warfare. Then we're already in the endgame, and every action we take now is simply deciding how we'll be remembered when our civilization falls. But until that moment arrives, we fight, we adapt, we survive. It's what we've always done. Saradomin protect us, Druzzle whispered. Zaros guide us, Akthanakos countered. Guthix preserve the balance, Karasi added. Lorne, ever practical, simply said, let's hope we're overreacting and he gets bored and leaves on his own. But none of them believed that. As they filed out of the secret chamber, emergency action plans already being drafted and messengers being dispatched to every major faction in Gielinor. One truth crystallized in each of their minds. Steve's arrival hadn't just introduced a powerful new entity to their world. It had introduced a question that challenged the very foundation of their reality. What happens when individual creative freedom, unconstrained by authority or system, confronts a civilization built entirely on hierarchical power structures? The answer, they feared, would reshape Gielinor forever. 3 days after the council meeting, Father Eric approached Steve's expanding base with careful, measured steps. The blocky entity had transformed a significant portion of Draenor Village's outskirts into something that belonged in a fever dream. Structures built from materials that shimmered between states of matter, farms growing crops at impossible speeds, and mechanisms that seemed to operate on principles that defied Gielinor's physical laws. Steve stood at a crafting table, a simple wooden bench that he'd placed and could apparently pick up at will, processing cobblestone into smooth stone blocks through nothing more than proximity and intention. "Greetings, Steve," Eric called out, his voice carefully neutral and friendly. "I hope I'm not disturbing your, work." Text appeared beside Steve's head. NPC dialogue. "Accepting quest?" Eric suppressed a shudder at being referred to as an NPC, but pressed forward with his script. "I've been speaking with some of Gielinor's more experienced explorers, and they mentioned something that might interest you. There are legends of a creature deep beneath the Grotworm lair, a massive dragon that exists partially outside our reality. It guards treasures and knowledge from ages past." Steve's head turned toward him with that characteristic 90-degree snap. "The creature is said to be nearly invincible," Eric continued, pulling out a carefully prepared map, enchanted by the Council's best cartographers to be maximally enticing. "It breathes fire that can melt steel, summons tortured souls to fight alongside it, and its scales are harder than any armor in Gielinor. Many of our greatest warriors have challenged it. Most never returned. Boss mob detected. Coordinates." Eric's hand trembled slightly as he handed over the map. "The entrance is here, through the Grotworm lair north of Falador. But Steve, I must warn you, this isn't like the zombies in Draenor Manor. The Queen Black Dragon is. Quest accepted. Fast traveling to location." Before Eric could finish his warning, Steve pulled out what looked like a bed, a perfect rectangular sleeping mat that materialized from his inventory. He placed it on the ground, lay down for exactly 3 seconds, then stood up. When he did, his entire body flickered, and he simply appeared elsewhere. Teleportation without runes, without spells, without any of the limitations that governed magical travel in Gielinor. Father Eric stared at the empty space where Steve had been, then at the bed that remained on the ground, an impossible object that shouldn't exist but somehow did. "Saradomin help us all," he whispered, then rushed to activate the communication crystal hidden in his robes. "He's taken the bait. Alert all observation teams, and may the gods have mercy on whatever happens next." Commander Karasi and 3 of her elite Void Knights materialized outside the Grotworm lair using conventional teleportation magic, their arrival signaled by the familiar crackle of law runes being consumed. They'd beaten Steve here by minutes. His fast travel apparently required him to physically traverse some of the distance. "Positions," Karasi commanded tersely. "Remember, we're here to observe only. Do not engage unless he directly threatens you. And if he does, retreat immediately. No heroics." The Void Knights fanned out, using advanced concealment techniques that made them nearly invisible in the cavern's darkness. High-level perception filters, blessed by Guthix himself to hide observers from even divine sight. Surely they would work on this blocky anomaly. Steve arrived 17 minutes later, walking with that same measured mechanical pace. He descended into the Grotworm lair without hesitation, his diamond pickaxe gleaming in his hand. The Grotworms, massive insectoid creatures that could rend armor with their mandibles, emerged from the walls to investigate the intruder. Steve swung his pickaxe once, twice, 3 times. Each Grotworm he struck simply stopped existing. Not dead, not wounded, completely erased from reality in a shower of pixels. Within 5 minutes, he'd cleared a path through creatures that normally required coordinated group efforts to defeat. And he'd done it while simultaneously mining through stone walls to create a more direct path downward. "He's carving a tunnel straight to the Queen's chamber," one of the Void Knights whispered through the communication crystal, ignoring the intended path entirely. "Of course he is," Karasi replied grimly. "He doesn't recognize game design. To him, there's just an objective and the most efficient path to reach it." The deeper Steve descended, the more the environment shifted. The Grotworm tunnels gave way to ancient stone carved with draconic script, then to crystalline formations that pulsed with latent magical energy. This was the Grotworm lair's deepest level, a place where reality grew thin and the Queen Black Dragon's presence warped the natural order. Steve broke through the final wall with his pickaxe and stepped into the Queen's arena. The Queen Black Dragon's chamber was a cathedral of nightmare, a vast space where the walls seemed to breathe, where shadows moved with predatory intelligence, and where the air itself tasted of ancient malice. 4 massive pillars stood at cardinal points, each one pulsing with necrotic energy that fed the Queen's immortality. And there, coiled in the center like a monument to draconic supremacy, was the Queen Black Dragon herself. She was massive, easily 50 meters from snout to tail, her black scales absorbing light like a void. Her eyes burned with intelligence that predated human civilization, and when she breathed, reality rippled around her. She had survived the Dragonkin's fury, outlasted kingdoms, and consumed hundreds of would-be heroes. She was one of Gielinor's ultimate challenges, designed to test the absolute peak of combat capability. She was also partially phased out of standard reality. existing simultaneously in multiple planes, a defense mechanism that made her nearly impossible to truly damage without understanding planar mechanics and consuming her energy pillars first. Steve looked at her. Text appeared. Ender Dragon detected. Initiating boss fight. The Queen Black Dragon's head snapped toward him, her ancient consciousness recognizing something fundamentally wrong about this blocky intruder. She'd faced warriors, mages, and even other dragons. But this entity didn't register on any spectrum of existence she understood. "You dare enter my domain." Her voice was telepathic, resonating directly in the minds of all present. A psychic assault that could shatter lesser beings' sanity. "I am the Queen of the Black Dragons, eldest of my kind, survivor of..." Skipping dialogue. Steve placed a block beneath his feet, then another, constructing a pillar that lifted him directly upward with impossible speed. The Queen's eyes widened in something approaching confusion. This wasn't how combat worked. Opponents were supposed to dodge her attacks, use the arena's mechanics, engage with the structure of the fight. Steve reached her eye level in seconds and swung his sword, that same purple gleaming netherite blade that had shattered Survivan's equipment. The Queen Black Dragon's reflexes were honed by millennia of combat. She unleashed a torrent of dragon fire directly at Steve's face. Not normal fire, but superheated plasma infused with necrotic magic that could reduce enchanted armor to slag. The temperature in the chamber spiked so high that the observing Void Knights' protective gear began smoking even from their concealed positions. The flames washed over Steve harmlessly, his health bar, visible only to him in whatever interface governed his existence, didn't drop a single point. Fire resistance in his framework apparently functioned on absolute terms, not percentages or tiers. His sword connected with the Queen's scales. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber. The Queen Black Dragon, who had withstood siege weapons, ancient magics, and the fury of other elder dragons, screamed. Not a roar of challenge, but a shriek of genuine pain. Her scales, harder than any material and naturally occurring in Gielinor, cracked under the netherite blade. Her health bar, hidden to most observers but somehow visible to Steve's mechanical assessment, dropped by nearly a quarter from a single strike. "Impossible!" The Queen thrashed, her massive tail sweeping through the arena in an attack that had crushed entire adventuring parties. Steve simply placed blocks beneath his feet, elevating himself above the sweep with casual ease. The tail smashed into his pillar, and the blocks didn't even crack. The Queen summoned her tortured souls, spectral minions bound to her will through dark magic, designed to overwhelm opponents while she recharged her more devastating attacks. Dozens of ghostly forms materialized, their wails designed to induce terror and paralysis. Steve equipped a bow, not a normal bow, but something that shimmered with impossible enchantments. Flame, power, infinity, all stacked in combinations that should have been mutually exclusive. He fired once. The arrow streaked through 3 tortured souls, and they evaporated, not banished back to their prison, but simply deleted from existence. He fired again, and again. Each arrow he loosed cost him nothing. The infinity enchantment ensured he never ran out of ammunition. Within 30 seconds, every summoned soul was gone. Commander Crossi watched through her observation crystal, her face pale. "He's not fighting her," she whispered. "He's solving her." like she's a puzzle with a known solution. The Queen Black Dragon, beginning to understand the existential danger she faced, retreated toward her energy pillars. The 4 columns pulsed with power, ready to restore her health and provide tactical advantages. She'd survived countless battles by using these pillars strategically, healing while her opponents exhausted themselves. Steve looked at the nearest pillar. Text appeared. Destructible environment detected. Optimizing strategy. He switched back to a diamond pickaxe and struck the pillar. Once, the ancient stone, enchanted by draconic magic and reinforced by centuries of necrotic energy, cracked. Twice. The enchantments failed. 3 times. The pillar shattered completely, millennia of carefully cultivated power dissipating in an instant. No, those pillars took centuries to... Steve destroyed the 2nd pillar, then the 3rd, then the 4th. In less than 60 seconds, he dismantled the entire support structure that made the Queen Black Dragon nearly immortal. The arena itself seemed to dim, the quasi-reality she'd imposed on the space collapsing back into standard physical laws. The Queen, now operating under normal Gielinor physics for the first time in ages, felt genuine fear. She launched her most devastating attack, the extreme dragon breath, a blast of energy that could phase through armor and directly attack the soul itself. Steve ate a steak, just pulled it from his inventory, a perfectly cooked piece of meat that materialized in his blocky hand, and consumed it in 3 mechanical bites. His health, which hadn't actually dropped, somehow visibly regenerated anyway. The food apparently operated on instant heal mechanics that ignored damage over time effects. Then he charged. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Steve's netherite sword struck the Queen's head, her neck, her exposed underbelly. Each hit dealt consistent, unavoidable damage that her draconic resistances couldn't reduce. She tried to fly, to use her aerial superiority. Steve built upward, constructing pillars and platforms with such speed that he effectively flew alongside her, matching her altitude in seconds. She dove underground, using the ancient tunnels to gain distance and ambush position. Steve simply mined through the stone directly toward her, his pickaxe cutting through solid rock like it was air. There was no escaping, no tactical retreat, no clever positioning that worked against someone who could edit the battlefield itself. The Queen Black Dragon, eldest of her kind, survivor of the God Wars, guardian of ancient secrets, fell after 7 minutes of combat. Her final roar shook the chamber, and as her massive body collapsed, it didn't leave a corpse. Instead, it dissolved into drops, materials, scales, bones, and something crystalline that Steve picked up and examined. Text appeared. Dragon egg acquired. Adding to collection. Commander Karasi and her Void Knights emerged from concealment, their cloaking magic failing as shock overwhelmed their concentration. They stared at the empty chamber where one of Gielinor's most fearsome entities had existed minutes ago. He called her the Ender Dragon, one of the knights said, his voice hollow. Not even her proper name. Just remapped her to fit his own framework. Steve was already constructing a crafting table in the middle of the arena, processing the Queen's remains into items. Scales became armor. Bones became weapons. The dragon egg, an object of immeasurable magical significance in Gielinor's lore, was simply placed as a decoration on a stone pedestal he built in 30 seconds. Karasi activated her communication crystal with trembling hands. Council, this is Observer Team Alpha. The Queen Black Dragon is gone. Completely. Steve defeated her in under 10 minutes. Her voice cracked. He stripped the arena of its mechanics, bypassed all intended difficulty scaling, and reduced an Elder Dragon to crafting materials. Guildmaster Lorne's voice came through, tight with barely controlled panic. Did you identify any weaknesses? Any limitation? None, Karasi replied. If anything, he's more efficient than we feared. He doesn't fight like a warrior or a mage. He solves encounters like they're mathematical equations. Find optimal path. Remove obstacles. Execute solution. No hesitation, no mercy, no concept of challenge as we understand it. Steve finished his crafting and looked around the now empty chamber. Text appeared. Boss defeated. Dungeon cleared. Searching for next objective. He pulled out his map, the one Father Eric had given him, and studied it. His blocky finger traced a path northward, toward the wilderness, toward the God Wars dungeon, toward places where Gielinor's most ancient and terrible forces still waged eternal battles. Multiple hostile faction bases detected. PvP zone identified. Proceeding to next area. Karasi's blood ran cold. He's heading for the God Wars dungeon. Alert everyone. Evacuate the area if possible. If he applies the same methodology there... She didn't need to finish the sentence. The God Wars dungeon contained concentrated remnants of divine power, locked in eternal conflict. Saradomin's forces, Zamorak's legions, Bandos's war parties, and Armadill's avian teas all fought there in a carefully balanced stalemate that had lasted since the gods themselves were banished. If Steve decided to clear that dungeon the way he'd cleared this one, he wouldn't just defeat a single boss. He'd unravel one of the most significant magical and theological sites in all of Gielinor. And based on what they'd just witnessed, none of them had any idea how to stop him. 6 weeks after Steve's arrival, Gielinor had fundamentally changed, not through conquest or divine intervention, but through the persistent, unsettling presence of an entity that refused to leave and couldn't be removed. The God Wars dungeon had been his next target, as predicted. Commander Karasi's emergency evacuation protocols had saved lives, pulling adventurers and pilgrims from the ancient battleground mere hours before Steve arrived. What followed was documented by long-range scrying spells operated by the Council's most powerful mages, each one watching with growing horror as Steve systematically dismantled millennia of theological conflict. He'd entered through the main entrance, ignoring the kill count requirements that normally barred access, and proceeded to treat the eternal war between divine factions as nothing more than a resource-gathering opportunity. Saradomin's forces, Zamorak's demons, Bandos's warriors, Armadill's aviantes, all fell with equal efficiency. Steve didn't discriminate between good and evil, order and chaos. To him, they were all just hostile mobs, dropping useful materials. General Grador, the Arg champion of Bondos, blessed with divine strength and tactical genius, lasted 4 minutes. Commander Ziliana, Saradomin's most devoted warrior angel, fell in 3. Kriara, the mighty Aviantes, blessed by Armadill himself, was defeated in 2. Kirill Tsutsaroth, demon general of Zamorak's legions, managed 5, not through superior power, but because Steve stopped mid-combat to build a small shelter and cook food. The most disturbing part wasn't the defeats themselves. It was what Steve did afterward. He built a base, right there in the God Wars dungeon, in the heart of divine conflict, He constructed a multi-level structure using materials harvested from the gods' own champions. Glass windows overlooking the frozen battlefield. Farms growing wheat where angels and demons had bled for centuries. Storage chests organized with mechanical precision, filled with divine artifacts treated like common loot. And then he simply stayed, not conquering, not claiming the space as territory, just existing there as if it were his natural right. The eternal war that had defined the region for millennia had been paused, not through divine mandate or mortal intervention, but because one blocky figure had decided the space was useful for his purposes. The Grand Exchange's secret chamber hosted its third emergency council in as many weeks. But this time, the desperation had curdled into something darker, reluctant acceptance. "We have to face reality," Guildmaster Lorne said, his face haggard from sleepless nights. "Every strategy has failed. Redirection worked temporarily, but he just completes our challenges and moves on. Combat is laughable. He's defeated everything we've positioned against him. And the economic implications." He gestured at the reports covering the table. "Adventurers are starting to ask questions. Why quest for dragon armor when Steve can craft superior equipment from materials he generates himself? Why pray to gods who couldn't stop him when they can just try to emulate his self-sufficiency?" High Priest Drezel looked like he'd aged a decade. "The theological damage is already spreading. I've received reports from priests across Gielinor. Faith is wavering, not because Steve preaches against the gods, but because he proves their irrelevance through simple existence. He needs no divine favor, no prayer, no sacrifice. He just is." 3 temples have emptied in Varric alone, Drezel continued, his voice breaking. "People are saying, if that blocky stranger can reshape reality through his own will, why do we need gods? I've spent my entire life teaching that divine authority is the bedrock of civilization, and now a single entity has shattered that teaching without even trying." Akthanakos remained silent, his ancient eyes fixed on a scrying orb showing Steve's God Wars dungeon base. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone witnessing the end of an era. "I consulted the oldest Zoroastrian texts, prophecies and warnings from the Second Age. There are references to world eaters and reality shapers that exist outside the Anima Mundi. Beings that don't draw power from Gielinor's life force, but bring their own rules with them. The texts say such entities can't be defeated, only adapted to or fled from. Zaros himself encountered one in the far reaches of the universe. His response was to leave, to abandon that plane of existence entirely and find a new one." The implication hung in the air like poison. "You're suggesting we abandon Gielinor?" Commander Karasi asked, disbelief and fury mixing in her voice. "This is our world, our home, everything we've built, every life we've sworn to protect. You want us to just surrender?" "I'm suggesting we recognize what Steve represents," Akthanakos replied coldly. "He's not an invader. He's a fundamental force, like gravity, like entropy. You don't defeat gravity through military might or theological superiority. You adapt to it, or you're crushed by it." Lorne's hands trembled as he poured himself water. "The economic models are clear. Within a year, if current trends continue, the Grand Exchange will be obsolete. Why buy arrows when you can enchant a bow with infinity? Why trade for food when crops grow to maturity in minutes? Why?" His voice cracked. Why maintain any of our carefully constructed systems when individual autonomy proves more efficient? Because chaos would reign, Drezel shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Because without structure, without hierarchy, without shared beliefs and common purpose, civilization collapses. Steve might not need society, but the rest of us do. We need trade. We need laws. We need meaning. Do we? Karasi asked quietly, the question clearly costing her. Or have we simply been told we need those things by the very systems that benefit from our dependence? I'm not saying Steve is right, but he's forced a question we've never had to truly answer. What if everything we've built is just an elaborate cage we've locked ourselves in? The silence that followed was profound. Reports flooded in from across Gielinor, each one documenting a different facet of the same crisis. Steve's existence had opened a philosophical wound that no amount of military force or theological authority could close. In Lumbridge, a young adventurer named Thomas had stopped mid-quest to ask his mentor a devastating question. Why am I grinding for levels when Steve operates outside the leveling system entirely? What's the point of my progression if it's just arbitrary rules I've agreed to follow? In Varrock, the Mages Guild faced mass resignations. Apprentices who'd spent years studying rune combinations watched Steve manipulate reality without a single law rune, without incantations, without any of the restrictions they'd been taught were fundamental to magic. The carefully constructed hierarchy of magical mastery, novice to master to archmage, suddenly felt like an artificial limitation rather than a natural law. In Falador, the White Knight's doctrine of righteous combat through honorable means clashed with the efficiency of Steve's pragmatic approach. Why engage in fair duels when you could simply build above your opponent and shoot arrows down? Why risk your life in heroic charges when you could methodically dismantle threats from a safe position? Honor and glory seemed like expensive luxuries compared to the cold effectiveness. Most troubling were reports from the wilderness. Adventurers had begun experimenting with Steve-like approaches, trying to break objects down to base components, attempting to reshape their environment, questioning every game mechanic they'd previously taken for granted. Most failed, bound as they were to Gielinor's inherent rules. But the attempts themselves represented something unprecedented, a mass rejection of accepted limitations. We're witnessing the birth of a new philosophy, Guildmaster Lorne said during the 4th Emergency Council meeting. I'm calling it creative anarchism, the belief that individual will and creative freedom supersede all established systems. Steve is the prophet, but the religion is spreading without him even preaching it. Akthanikos nodded grimly. Zaros always taught that power flows from hierarchy, from submission to higher authority in exchange for elevated status. But Steve proves that power can be absolute and self-generated. If enough people truly internalize that lesson. Revolution, Karasi finished. Not political, philosophical. A fundamental rejection of every power structure we've built. 2 months after his arrival, the council made a decision that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. They would attempt diplomacy. Not as equals, they weren't delusional enough to think themselves Steve's equals, but as the native inhabitants of a world he'd decided to occupy. Father Eric volunteered to be the envoy. He found Steve at his God Wars dungeon base, the blocky figure standing atop a tower he'd built that overlooked the frozen battlefield. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across a landscape that had become an impossible hybrid of Gielinor's medieval fantasy and Steve's geometric pragmatism. "Steve," Eric called up, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and exhaustion. "May I speak with you?" The text appeared. Dialogue initiated. "Speak." Eric climbed the tower, proper stairs this time, not the pillar-jumping Steve preferred, and stood beside the entity that had reshaped their understanding of reality. For a long moment, he simply looked out at the view. "You've changed everything," Eric said finally. "You probably don't realize it, but your presence here has shaken the foundations of our entire civilization. People are questioning gods, abandoning hierarchies, rejecting systems that have existed for millennia. All because you prove those systems aren't universal laws. They're just agreements, collective decisions that can be opted out of if you have enough power." Interesting. Is this a problem? For us? Yes. Our world functions because people agree to operate within certain frameworks. Levels, skills, combat formulas, economic principles. They create order from chaos. But you've shown that order is optional. And once people realize something is optional, they start wondering why they ever chose it in the first place. Steve turned toward him. That characteristic 90-degree head rotation that never stopped being unsettling. "What do you want?" "I want to understand," Eric said honestly. "You've defeated our greatest threats, reshaped our landscapes, and ignored our most fundamental rules. But you haven't conquered. You haven't enslaved. You've just existed. Why? What do you want from Gielinor?" The text that appeared was simple, almost devastatingly so. "Building, exploring, surviving, creating. That's all I ever do. World doesn't matter, just the process." Eric felt something break inside him. Not despair, but a strange, terrible understanding. Steve wasn't a conqueror or a destroyer. He was something far more destabilizing. A tourist. Gielinor, with all its history and significance, all its cosmic struggles and divine drama, was just another world to explore, another sandbox to play in. Their civilization's fundamental questions, good versus evil, order versus chaos, mortality versus divinity, meant nothing to an entity whose only purpose was creative self-expression. "Can I ask one thing?" Eric said quietly. Will you leave, eventually, when you're done exploring and building? Maybe, when I get bored, or find a new world, or decide to build something bigger. No timeline, just playing. Just playing." Those two words again, the ones that haunted every council meeting, every theological debate, every economic analysis. The entire existential crisis boiled down to the fact that Steve was just playing, and Gielinor was his playground. 6 months after Steve's arrival, Gielinor had settled into an uneasy new normal. Steve remained, building increasingly elaborate structures, occasionally defeating the legendary threats with casual efficiency, and completely ignoring the political and theological implications of his existence. The Council's final strategy had become simple survival through adaptation. They couldn't defeat him. They couldn't remove him. They could only minimize his impact and try to maintain social order while their civilization processed the philosophical earthquake he'd triggered. New signs appeared throughout major cities, carefully worded by the council. Remember, traditional methods still work for traditional people. Skills levels and community bonds remain valuable even if alternative approaches exist. Maintain faith in established systems while respecting individual paths. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but kept society from total collapse. The Grand Exchange adapted by offering Steve-proof services, social connections, quest guidance, community experiences that pure efficiency couldn't replicate. The temples reframed their messaging, emphasizing spiritual meaning rather than divine power. The combat guilds taught efficiency and innovation alongside tradition. But everyone knew the truth. They weren't adapting to Steve. They were adapting to the idea of Steve, the proof that everything they'd built was contingent rather than absolute. Commander Karasi stood in the secret chamber one final time, addressing the council that had become a permanent fixture of crisis management. "We need to accept what Steve represents," she said, her voice carrying hard-won wisdom. "He's not going away. And even if he did, the damage is done. He's shown us that our world's rules are just parameters in a system. Parameters that can be overridden by sufficient will and different frameworks. We can't unknow that." Guildmaster Lorne nodded wearily. The economy has restructured around his existence. Some adventurers are trying to emulate his self-sufficiency. Others are doubling down on community interdependence. We're seeing a philosophical split that will define the next era of Gielinor's history. High Priest Drazel looked older than ever, but there was a strange peace in his eyes. Perhaps this was always coming. We've had gods, we've had heroes, we've had cosmic forces beyond comprehension. But we've never had proof that individual creative will could supersede divine authority. Steve is that proof, whether we like it or not. Gielinor has entered a new age. Akthanakos spoke last, his ancient voice carrying the weight of someone who'd survived countless paradigm shifts. Zaros once told me that the universe favors adaptation over tradition. Entities that can't evolve to new realities get replaced by those who can. Steve hasn't conquered us. He's challenged us to justify our existence, to prove that our systems, our hierarchies, our carefully constructed order serve genuine purposes beyond mere control. "Can we?" Karasi asked. "I don't know," Akthanakos admitted. "But that's the question we'll spend the next century trying to answer." High above the God Wars dungeons, Steve continued building. He'd started construction on something massive, a structure that seemed to serve no tactical purpose, no defensive function. It was just art, a monument to creative expression, built because he could build it, existing because he willed it to exist. Below, Gielinor's inhabitants went about their lives, forever changed by the knowledge that their world's fundamental rules were negotiable. Some clung tighter to tradition, finding comfort in familiar structures. Others pushed boundaries, experimenting with new approaches inspired by Steve's example. Most simply tried to reconcile the irreconcilable, how to maintain meaningful civilization, when one entity had proven that civilization itself was optional. The Grand Exchange still functioned, though its volume had dropped. The temple still held services, though attendance had shifted. The kingdom still maintained armies, though everyone understood their power was relative rather than absolute. Gielinor hadn't ended. It had evolved, forced to justify itself in ways it never had before. And Steve, indifferent to the chaos his presence created, continued his simple routine: building, exploring, surviving, creating. just playing in a world that would never be the same. The final report submitted to the council, written by Father Eric 6 months after Steve's arrival, concluded with these words: "We cannot defeat Steve because there is nothing to defeat. He is not an enemy. He is a mirror, reflecting the truth that our carefully constructed reality is just one possible interpretation of existence. He proves that power need not flow from gods, that structure need not depend on hierarchy, that individual can reshape entire worlds if freed from artificial constraints. The question is not how to remove him, but what we choose to do with this knowledge. Do we adapt our systems to acknowledge individual creative freedom while maintaining social cohesion? Do we double down on tradition and pray that most people choose comfortable certainty over terrifying liberty? Or do we acknowledge that Steve has ended one age of Gielinor and begun another, an age where the relationship between individual and system, between freedom and structure, between creative will and collective order must be renegotiated from first principles? Steve will likely leave someday, as casually as he arrived. But the questions he's forced us to confront will remain, long after his blocky form disappears from our world. We are not the same civilization we were before he came. We never will be again. And perhaps that's not a tragedy. Perhaps it's an evolution we should have undertaken centuries ago, but needed an impossible outsider to finally force upon us. Or perhaps it's the beginning of our end. Time will tell. In his base at the God Wars dungeon, Steve placed the final block on his monument and stepped back to admire his work. Text appeared beside him. Project complete. Searching for next objective. This world has good building mechanics. Might stay longer. And somewhere in Varrock, in taverns and temples, in throne rooms and guild halls, people continued debating the question that would define their era. What happens when individual creative freedom, absolute and unconstrained, enters a world built entirely on shared limitations and collective agreements? The catastrophe wasn't Steve's arrival. The catastrophe was the question he'd left behind, a question that would echo through Gielinor's future, challenging every certainty, destabilizing every authority, and forcing a civilization to finally confront the difference between what is and what could be. And that question, unlike Steve himself, would never leave.